Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In a quiet Ohio suburb, lawns are perfectly trimmed, mailboxes gleam in the summer sun, and family dogs bark behind white picket fences like in commercials. But behind these immaculate facades, the silence of the opulent houses often hides more screams than one might imagine. Screams muffled by the thick walls, by shame, by fear. 9-year-old Elijah Carter lived in one of them. And every night, that silence weighed more heavily on him than the noise. Elijah had neither the words to describe his pain, nor the shoulders to carry it. He didn't yet know how to name the violence, the humiliation, the abandonment. He didn't know that what he was experiencing was abnormal. He believed he was the problem. But he had the eyes. And he recorded everything. The Carters, seen from the outside, embodied the American dream. A large red brick house, 2 immaculate SUVs, admiring neighbors. Gregory Carter, the father, a decorated war veteran, was hailed throughout the neighborhood. He spoke firmly, stood as straight as a flag. His wife, Madeline, beautiful and elegant, ran a charitable foundation for underprivileged children. A cruel irony, considering how she ignored her own son's tears. But behind closed doors, far from the charity dinners and fixed smiles, Elijah was just an annoying detail in their perfect picture. In their eyes, he was too emotional, not strong enough, weak. For Gregory, emotion was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. Every morning, Elijah had to make his bed squarely, fold his clothes with pinpoint precision, and come down to attention for breakfast. One wrong word, one insolent look, one unwashed plate, and the sentence would be handed down. Hours spent kneeling on the icy garage tiles. Skipped meals, days without permission to speak. Sometimes, when Gregory truly lost it, the blows would fall. Always methodical. Always followed by a lecture on discipline. Madeline said nothing. She walked past her punished son without looking at him. Her lipstick flawless, her heels clicking on the marble, she melted into her role as a model wife with surgical indifference. When Elijah timidly tried to speak, she replied, "Your father knows what he's doing. Be a man." Elijah closed himself off. He learned not to cry, not to scream. He began to breathe silently, to walk silently, to anticipate gestures, to read moods like a soldier in enemy territory. He was 9 years old, but he lived like a prisoner. And school wasn't a refuge. On the contrary, it was another scene of execution, more refined, more perverse. The private school the Carters attended boasted of welcoming America's future elite. In truth, it primarily educated the children of the white elite, those whose names already appeared on the plaques of courthouses or business firms. Elijah was an anomaly there. One of the only black students. He didn't wear the same brands of clothing, didn't live in the same neighborhoods as his classmates. And despite his parents' apparent affluence, he didn't have the same social legitimacy in their eyes. The mockery was constant. Were you adopted? Is it true that 20 of you live in one house? You're the one who cleans the tables at home, aren't you? And every word stuck a needle in. Every laugh added weight. They stole his pens, emptied his water bottle into his notebooks, scribbled insults in his textbooks. One day, a boy slipped a note into his locker with the words, "Go back where you came from." He didn't yet understand the full significance of those words. But he knew they hurt. The teachers saw nothing. Or pretended not to. Elijah became invisible. It was simpler that way. But Elijah saw everything. He observed. He listened. He learned. Every injustice, every name, every act. He jotted it down in a small notebook he'd found in his father's library. A black notebook with a hard cover. He wrote in secret, every night, by the light of a nightlight. It was written on the front page. "One day I will return. And when that day comes, you will not forget my name." He slipped the notebook under a floorboard behind his bed. No one would read it. It was his sanctuary. His safe. His memory. He wasn't crying anymore. He was building. Not a wall. A weapon. Patient. Cold. Seemingly harmless. But ready, one day, to strike where no one would expect. At 14, with winter in full swing and snow slowly erasing the tracks on Cleveland's sidewalks, Elijah Carter decided to take refuge in a place where, for once, no one asked him to be quiet. The municipal library. It was an ancient building, almost forgotten by teenagers his age, but to him it was a silent cathedral, a sanctuary. That day, he wasn't looking for anything in particular. He wandered among the shelves, trailing his fingers over the dusty bindings. Then, by chance, he came across a name he didn't recognize, James Baldwin, the title of the book, Next Time, Fire. He opened it at random, read a few lines, then sat down in an armchair by the window. What he read pierced him. It takes a lot of strength to endure a world that tells you every day that you have none. The words hit him like a slap in the face and a bomb at the same time. For the first time, Elijah was reading someone who not only expressed their pain, but named it, unpacked it, transformed it into sharp intelligence. Baldwin wrote with a painful grace, a pitiless lucidity, and yet he didn't scream. That was the shock. That quiet anger. That elegance in revolt. From then on, Elijah returned to the library every day. It became his second home. He devoured Baldwin, then came across Malcolm X, and his words like lightning. He discovered Toni Morrison, and the burning poetry of Black memory. Then Angela Davis, and his unshakable intellectual strength. He read not only to understand, but to regain possession of himself. In one of his notebooks he wrote, "I thought I was broken. I find out I was just unarmed." Each book was a brick in the reconstruction of his identity. He was not born weak. He had been trained to think he was. He had been taught to walk with his eyes downcast, to speak softly, to ask permission to exist. But these authors taught him another truth, that of his stolen dignity, and of his still dormant power. That same year, at school, a discreet look changed everything. Mrs. Langford, his English literature teacher, had noticed his quiet but methodical behavior. Elijah didn't speak often, but when he wrote, each word seemed posed with a rare intensity. One day, she assigned an assignment, "Tell me about a moment that changed you." Elijah hesitated. He wrote, then tore it up. Rewrote it. Then let go of all restraint. His text was entitled, "The Night I Heard the Silence Speak to Me." In it, he spoke of a childhood memory, a punishment in the garage, kneeling on the frozen concrete, the lights off, alone with the sound of his breathing. He didn't accuse anyone, but he spoke of fear, shame, anticipation, and that inner voice he had heard that night, the one telling him not to disappear. Mrs. Langford read her essay at home. She cried. The next day, without telling him, she sent the text to a national speech competition in Washington. When Elijah learned about it, he panicked. He refused at first. But something inside him, nourished by Baldwin, Morrison, and this professor with the sincere gaze, whispered to him, "It's time." On the day of the competition, Elijah wore a white shirt he had ironed himself. He walked into the large room where 300 people were waiting for him. He felt tiny. The microphone was too high. The light too bright. His heart was pounding. He breathed. Closed his eyes. Then he spoke. The title of his speech. "To those who tried to break me, thank you." The silence in the room was heavy, total. He spoke without naming names. A father who confused authority with humiliation. Classmates who thought being black was a weakness. Adults who looked the other way. He didn't shout. He didn't seek pity. His voice was calm, deep, mature beyond his years. Each word fell like a verdict. "You made me believe I was nothing. But thanks to you, I learned I could become everything. Thank you for showing me what I didn't want to become. Thank you for sharpening my loneliness." It became my weapon. When he finished, there was a brief silence. Then a wave. The entire room rose, some with tears in their eyes. He saw, among the judges, a woman looking at him as if he had just reminded her why she did this job. He won the competition. But even more than the price, it was this moment that he remembered, the silence of a crowd that, for the first time, was truly listening to him. That day, Elijah Carter realized he had a voice. And that it could move mountains. The years passed, and with them, illusions. Elijah grew, and with him grew a controlled anger, a brutal lucidity, an underground force that nothing seemed able to extinguish. At 17, he no longer sought his parents' love. He wanted their silence. He wanted their absence. And he got it. It was after a final affront, one winter evening, when Gregory, his father, violently pushed him against a wall because Elijah had dared to defend a black classmate insulted by a teacher. That night, Elijah straightened up, wiped the blood from his lip, fixed his eyes on Gregory's, and said in a calm voice, "The next time you raise your hand to me, you pray I don't answer. And trust me, you won't be able to bear my answer." He didn't wait for a reaction. He went up to his room, grabbed his bag, his notebook, his essential books, and left. He spent a few days on the streets, sleeping in libraries and building lobbies, refusing to go to shelters so as not to lose his dignity. Then, one night, while he was reading in an open church pew, a man approached him, Reverend Marcus Harris, a Baptist minister with an active faith, who recognized something deeply familiar in the boy's eyes, the fire contained. Marcus invited him to lunch. Then to stay for an evening. Then for a week. Then treated him like a son. But without ever demanding love in return. He offered him what no one had ever offered him, an unconditional space. And Elijah, for the first time, let his guard down. Marcus Harris introduced him to other thinkers, Cornel West, Bell Hooks, Derek Bell. He encouraged him to channel his rage into structures, not shouts. Elijah understood then that revenge could become justice. When it was thought of as a collective transformation. Thanks to Marcus and his own excellent academic results, Elijah obtained a full scholarship to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., in the law program. There, he entered an even more demanding, more elitist world, but this time, he was no longer afraid. He had learned to read between the lines of power. At Georgetown, he became one of the best in his class. Not because he wanted to shine, but because he wanted to understand, master, and use the system's weapons against the system. He joined political think tanks, wrote incisive articles on institutional racism, and participated in legal clinics to defend at-risk youth. He slept only 4 hours a night. The rest of the time, he read, argued, and wrote. And in the shadows, his black book had grown. He had transformed it into a real classified file, methodical, almost clinical. The names of his former executioners. The precise facts. The dates. The evidence. Not for blind revenge. But for aim right. At 28, Elijah Carter returned to Cleveland. He now had a solid reputation in activist and legal circles. But he chose to keep a low profile. He opened a small practice in an old red brick building on the corner of two unassuming streets. A simple plaque on the door read, "Elijah Carter, Civil Law and Social Justice." But very quickly, his name was circulating. Because he won. Because he wasn't intimidated by anyone. Because he asked the right questions, where it hurt. He was soon nicknamed, the one you can't stop. He argued as one enters a war. But calmly. Precisely. Graciously. Each word weighed like a sharp blade. Then one day, the past knocked on the door of the present. A former student at his old private school, who had become a teacher himself, was accused of sexually and morally harassing several young black students. The case initially generated little publicity. But when a civil rights lawyer was brought in to be part of the external investigation team, Elijah Carter's name pops up. And then everything changed. He entered that school like a ghost returned to demand justice. The walls were the same. The smell of shoe polish, the trophies in the display cases, the arrogant stares in the hallways. Nothing had changed. He was no longer a child. He sat down in front of the old teachers who had ignored him, humiliated him, despised him. Some didn't recognize him. Others did. And they turned pale. He questioned. He confronted. He never raised his voice. But every sentence was a revelation. In what year were you informed of these behaviors? How many complaints have you covered up? Do you think silence is acquittal? He met up with old friends, now teachers or administrators. He recalled the events they thought had been forgotten. Some broke down. Others fled the scene in the media. But everyone understood one thing: he remembered everything. The school lost its major funding. Sponsors withdrew. Journalists began digging. Powerful families, once protected, found themselves exposed. Lawsuits were launched. Compensation payments were made. Careers ruined. But Elijah wasn't looking for money or fame. He was looking to restore balance. To make it clear that what they had done to children, generation after generation, would never again go unpunished. He never needed to raise his fist. He had learned to raise his voice, where it carried. He was no longer the overly sensitive boy. He had become the elegant nightmare of the powerful. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves carpeted the sidewalks like a fragile reminder of the past, Elijah pushed open the door of a veterans center in Ohio. The air was warm, saturated with the smell of floor polish, old newspapers, and loneliness. Old men, some amputees, others lost in memories only they could see, played cards or watched television without really following it. Elijah walked slowly down the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He had hesitated to come. He expected nothing. No forgiveness. No emotion. No reparation. Only a clear, clean ending, without rancor but without tenderness. Gregory Carter, his father, occupied a room down the hall, on the left. A nurse escorted him to the door. She whispered. "He doesn't talk much. He often forgets faces. But he never stopped talking about a son. Elijah, I think." He didn't answer. He opened the door. The late daylight bathed the room in a pale halo. Gregory sat in an armchair by the window, his back hunched, his eyes lost in a landscape he no longer truly looked at. His hands trembled, thin, stained by time. An empty bottle lay on the floor, ignored for days. He turned his head slowly when he heard the door. His gaze took a while to focus. Then he narrowed his eyes. "Elijah?" The voice was hoarse, barely audible, as if speaking was difficult. Elijah approached. He stood there, straight, 2 meters away. Not a smile. No anger either. Just a deep, almost icy calm. "Yes. The son you thought you would break." Gregory blinked, as if trying to cling to a faded memory. What have you become?" Elijah looked at him for a long time. He leaned in slightly, his face level with that of the man who had embodied his fear, his silence, his childhood nightmares. "I have become what you feared most. Free." Gregory wanted to speak. He raised his hand, hesitant, as if to touch a ghost. But Elijah stepped back, just a step. The gesture stopped in midair. Gregory froze. Tears welled up in the old man's eyes. Tears that neither war, nor death, nor time had been able to tear away. But there, facing this son who had become a man, who had become strong, who had become other, they came. Late. Useless. Elijah looked at him for a few more seconds. Then he said, in a voice that was almost soft, but sharp as a sharp blade. "You wanted to make me an obedient soldier. You created a fighter. But not for yourself. For those like me. For those you crushed, thinking you were training them." He straightened up and adjusted his jacket. "You didn't lose a son. You never knew what a son could be." And he went away. He didn't turn around. In the months that followed, Elijah continued his fight. But now, something had been released in him. He was no longer haunted. He hadn't forgiven, but he had laid down the burden. He knew that some men die before their death, prisoners within their own walls. His father was one of them. At every conference, every court case won, every workshop he led for children in care, Elijah ended with this phrase, which became his signature. Tyrants never know what they unleash. They think they are hitting a child. But sometimes what they strike is the spark of a fire they can never put out. And in the eyes of these children sitting in silence, sometimes hurt, often suspicious, he saw the birth of what he had once been, the start of a fire.